I don't know if this video will look contradictory to my last video. My last video was definitely veering towards conservative ways of thinking, and this will no doubt be regarded as more to the left. Well, with any issue, any given issue, I look at it from a perspective of this is how I see it, not like I'm going to consciously be left or consciously be right. And every issue is different, so that's how I approach it. I try to be open-minded with every issue, so not necessarily a case of I'm so dogmatic that I absolutely 100% dismiss other points of view. On the crime thing, I do find liberal left attitudes frustrating, but there's other areas where I find right-wing attitudes frustrating. Nevertheless, it doesn't mean that I'm totally 100% divorced from those sort of views, depending on how they're put across. That might have sounded like, I don't know, gibberish, but I know what I'm talking about. Anyway, okay, so the hotels. Um, these protests that have been going on have kind of exemplified something that the government cannot ignore, and something that's going to be like an open wound if it's not resolved soon. There have been warnings that we could see a repeat of last year's violence on that sort of scale across England. Um, I have to say, England, it didn't really happen in Scotland. I don't know about Wales. Northern Ireland, yes, we saw the violence earlier this year in Ballymena. Um, One thing I want to say off the top of this video is the argument that all the protesters peaceful is disingenuous. They're not. There are clearly people have been masking up and attacking the police and spray painting uh, buildings and so on. So I don't think they can say it's wholly peaceful. I mean, this doesn't look particularly peaceful to me. You could see the police there clearly under pressure, clearly dealing with angry people. I'm going to read out this piece from the Eye simply because, yes, it's a left wing stance, but I do feel, I've said this before, that the way immigration is debated in this country, I feel is overwhelmingly negative. So, if for no other reason than offering some balance, I will read this out. Um, Here we go. I think actually in the same edition, this is the Eye from the 5th of August. There's a piece by Yasmin Alibi Brown, and I definitely don't agree with her on all issues. I find she tends to race bait sometimes. I don't care for it. Not entirely wrong with some of the things she's making in this op-ed. I think it's in this paper. I'll just double check. Bear with me a second. Um, this particular piece is offering a perspective that you will not see in the Sun or the Express or the Mail. Wow. Actually, they have a piece, Far Out Smear Campaign Embarrassing for Labour. Gets into what I was talking about regarding crime and how Labour are in no position to be attacking others on this. Anyway, here we go. I'm just going to read out this report. It feels like people are against us. We are not welcome. This report by Isabel Loubser, Loubser. Asylum seekers who fled their home countries amid the threat of persecution have spoken of their fears of anti-migrant protesters demonstrate outside the UK hotels they live in, demonstrating, I think that should be. Hundreds of anti-migrant protesters descended on the Thistle Barbican Hotel in Islington on Saturday. Some adorned in England shirts chanting, "Thistle Barbican need to go," locals say no. Police were forced to push back and separate the group, and officers made 9 arrests, six of which were under the Public Order Act. So no, they're not peaceful protests. In the days leading up to the protest, several asylum seekers housed in the hotel told the I paper of the fears as demonstrations take place across the country. Ahmed, this is not real names, has been living in the hotel for the past 26 months. Back in Iran, he was a stage and screen actor and taught acting and singing to college students. He became aware of the planned protest through Facebook groups that gathered more than 900 members in a matter of days. Leading up to the protest, social media posts featuring misinformation about rates of crime around the hotel and the ethnicities of its residents were spread widely, racking up thousands of likes and shares. If I knew it was like this, maybe I would have stayed in my country, Ahmed said. Maybe I would have been killed. Maybe I would have been tortured. I sometimes think that would have been better than this, because now I feel ashamed. That's an extraordinary thing to say. Ahmed said he was forced to flee because he is a Sunni Muslim, a minority in Iran, and for encouraging his female students to protest against the mandatory hijab rule. That's the irony. This particular point is important because the protesters say they're protecting women and girls. Yet here you have a guy who himself is protecting women and girls in Iran, a country that has severe persecution of women and girls. Yet they're just tarring him with the same brush as the Ethiopian who is allegedly involved in a rape. He said, when I arrived here, I was thinking, we're here, we have our respect because people say you fight for your freedom, for human rights. But when I arrived here, I found out we are not welcome here. In the week leading up to the protest, police estimate that 800 people could arrive, many from outside London. This is regarding the protest. The entrances to the hotel were barricaded and residents were advised not to leave. One charity worker showed the iPaper messages she had received from residents of the hotel asking whether the protesters had come to kill them. Ali, again, this is not a real name, fled Afghanistan after being pursued by the Taliban for teaching IT to girls. He remained in his room as he heard demonstrators shout. The protest, he said, made him anxious and reminded him of the persecution he faced in Afghanistan. Ali said, we came here seeking safety and a chance to work, learn and contribute. But now we're facing a different kind of pressure. Back home we suffered physical persecution. Here it's emotional. It feels like people are against us. We weren't safe there because the Taliban hated anyone who didn't share their extremist mentality. Sadly, some of the hostility we're seeing here reminds me of that same mindset, just in a different form. Um, Yasmin Alibai's brown pieces in the yellow paper, and I don't want to disturb the flow of this video, so I'll just mention it. She said that the protesters seem to have this mentality that all male migrants are thugs, rapists, savages trying to kill and hurt British girls. Like I said, I don't always agree with Yasmin Alibi Brown, but the way they demonstrate, the way they hold up signs saying protect our girls, they do vilify migrants. Um, Even Yasmin Alibi Brown conceded if that Ethiopian suspect is guilty of the rape, he should be charged, punished, and deported. No question about it. No reasonable person would argue against that. But there is definitely a dehumanization and a vilification of migrants. Again, when that disaster happened the other day on the Red Sea between Ethiopia and Yemen, between Eritrea and Yemen, actually, that particular route, it's a huge disaster, um, possibly more than 100 drowned. Sort of sick comments were things like, oh, it's bad for the fish. This dehumanization of migrants is disgusting. And I really wonder, those people protesting, um, what would they do if they were in the shoes of the migrants? I mean, what would they do? You know, and the irony is those two cases are men who were trying to help women and girls. What's interesting too is she pointed out in her piece that almost half of those charged with the violence last year also had records of domestic violence. That's why I take a very dim view of this attitude that they're protecting women and girls. Only when the perpetrator is a migrant, allegedly. Um, don't tell me that someone who gets boozed up and wants to torch a migrant hotel is going to be okay with his girlfriend when his favourite football team loses. So there's a hypocrisy there regarding the threat to women and girls. Now, in terms of far right thing, I've spoke about this before. Um, it tends to be when that issue is brought up, there's this reactionary sort of, oh, don't smear us all as far right. There's no far right involvement at all. Well, both those positions are extreme. Smearing everyone who has concerns about immigration is extreme, as far right is extreme. But saying that there's no far right involvement is disingenuous nonsense. Homeland, which is known to be an offshoot of patriotic alternative is known to be involved. One thing I don't like about these protests is there is a lynch mob mentality. They claim that they're peaceful. Well, honestly, if a migrant were to step out of that building, whether it be in Islington or Epping or elsewhere, people say, why are the police there? Because if one of those people were to dare to step out of the hotel, I honestly think there's a very real chance they would be lynched. In fact, there was footage of a Deliveroo driver being surrounded by the mob somewhere in London because there's been reports that some of them are working illegally. But you cannot tell me that these protesters are wholly peaceful. I think it's a disingenuous argument. And by the way, just because there's women and children involved in the protest doesn't make it peaceful either. There were so-called mothers last year bringing their children to riots. One yob was throwing stones at the police and actually brought her child along to watch. So just because women are involved doesn't suddenly make it civil and peaceful. Um, that's why I have a big problem with this argument that it's wholly peaceful and it's wholly legitimate. It's not legitimate if people are acting on misinformation, for example, about crimes taking place around a hotel. Um, I do think there is issues around this subject. I think that I've said it before. I think the hotel model, putting migrants in hotels, is a powder keg. It's that needs to change. I also think that there are people coming into this country that clearly should not be in this country. But I also think there's a lynch mob mentality around these so-called peaceful protests, and it's being exacerbated by false information online. Trump was talking when he was in Scotland with the Prime Minister. He was saying, "I hope my Truth Social isn't banned." Well, Truth Social is drenched in lies, and it's one of many sites that fans the flames rather than produces answers. Um, I'm not some sort of bleeding heart liberal that thinks everyone should be let in, but I do have a problem with the dehumanization of migrants. I've known a few. I've known a young Iranian guy who was, his background was in filmography. He was interested in filmmaking, and he was fleeing Iran because he was a Christian. In many cases, that's the sort of people we're talking about. But there's this sort of dehumanization whereby every male migrant is labeled to be a rapist, because some might be. I don't think that's an excuse to dehumanize all of them. And it's certainly not an excuse to justify a mob mentality. I think there is a problem with immigration where you get these sort of situations in areas that have social deprivation. Um, And there was footage I know of some of the migrants waving from the hotel. Well, that was very stupid. They're putting themselves at risk by doing that. But clearly, this report also suggests that there's a real fear there. I mean, imagine fleeing a war zone, imagine fleeing persecution, only to come to a supposedly safe country and have a mob gathered outside wanting to kill you. So when people write these comments saying, these are peaceful protests, no far right involvement, it's disingenuous. They're not peaceful, and yes, there is far right involvement. That doesn't make me woke or a leftist to point that out. Homeland has absolutely been stoking up this situation. Now, of course, people have legitimate concerns about immigration. Of course, people have a right to express those concerns genuinely peacefully. But the protests aren't peaceful. That's the point. Um, and like I say, if a migrant were to step outside that hotel, there's a very real chance they would be lynched. I always find it astonishing how people describe themselves as being peaceful and yet they do something that clearly contradicts that. The one in, one out scheme that the government's proposing clearly is not going to work. I think that the smash the gangs approach is morally justifiable, but it's harder to enact on that's what the government's been saying for a long time and it hasn't worked. Um, it may be that the system within the UK needs to act more as a deterrent, but I also think there's a lot of misinformation going around. Anyway, that's my stance on this issue. I think that clearly there's people we shouldn't be letting into this country. Clearly there needs to be tougher vetting. clearly we simply cannot let everyone in. And I do think the hotel situation needs to be changed. But remember last year when one of the migrant holding centres, there was sort of cartoons like Disney paintings put up on the wall so it would be less traumatizing for young children. And then Robert Jenrick ordered that be covered up. A lot of people criticize that as being callous. Well, I think people have this perception that because it's hotels, the migrants are sort of having luxury, like they're in five-star hotels, and it's all. I'm not sure that it's like that inside. I'd be surprised if it was. But frankly, wherever they were sent, if it was leisure centres or if it was any other sort of building, it would be targeted anyway. I think that there is a mob mentality out there, and it's very ugly, it's very volatile, and it's being fueled by misinformation. But at the same time, we do need to get a control on small boats. It's clearly not a sustainable model. It's good to see French police taking a more hardline stance recently, but one method could be making those boats unseaworthy, completely unseaworthy, like letting them down. The recent agreement the government had, Keir Starmer has had with Friedrich Merz in Germany, of cracking down on warehouses, housing, like holding the boats might be one approach. The truth is, there's no easy answer to this. People have shown that they're willing to risk their lives to cross the channel, um, and they need to know, from the places that they're coming from, whether that be in France or the source, the countries themselves that they're fleeing, that there is a hostile reception in the UK. Maybe that will be a deterrent. I don't know. But I do not like this mob mentality, and I make no apology for calling it out because that's what it is. So if people want to say that they have a right to express concerns peacefully, then do it peacefully. Don't act like a mob. When they gather outside hotels, chant. The reason the police are there is because if they weren't there, people would be dragged out and lynched. It's a very, very ugly thing. And there's a basis to that. Last year, there was thugs going around trying to set fire to buildings with people inside, which also threatened the safety of the hotel staff. So do not tell me that this is wholly peaceful. It's a lie. And do not tell me there's no far right involvement because there clearly is. With that, of course, if someone's come to this country, I was going to say my perception is that if I see someone who's come to the country and it's known that they have a criminal record and then they commit a crime, that's, biting the hand that feeds them essentially. They should be deported and they shouldn't be here. Um, but I do think there's a lot of misinformation over the subject, and I think the British press is overwhelmingly negative in their coverage, which itself is misinforming the public, um, because they're cherry picking the bad stuff and not considering the overall picture here, not considering that actually most male migrants are not rapists. Some are, but is that an excuse to vilify and dehumanize all of them? I don't think so. Especially not when you learn that some of these guys have actually been persecuted for trying to help women and girls. I would say that an Afghan teacher who has risked his life to protect women and girls is far less threat than some boozed up football hooligan who's shouting England at the top of his lungs and threatening to burn down a hotel.